A woman 7 months pregnant and utterly alone stumbles through a Wyoming blizzard. She's knocking on the door of a remote cabin, her last hope in a world of blinding white. The door creaks open, and she finds herself staring down the barrel of a rifle. But you have to understand something. The man holding that gun, with weary, haunted eyes, he isn't the biggest threat out here. Not even close. The real monster, the one that's far more dangerous than any blizzard or any frontiersman with a rifle, is the one she's running from. And he is coming for her. The wind was a monster. That's the only way to describe it. It screamed across the frozen plains of Wyoming, a physical thing made of ice and fury. It was February of 1887 and the world had vanished, swallowed by a blizzard that would be talked about for generations. Out in that white hell, every step was a battle, and Abigail Foster was losing. One hand was pressed tight against the swell of her belly, a tiny life kicking inside her. The other clutched a threadbare shawl that did almost nothing against the teeth of the wind. She was 7 months pregnant, and she'd been walking for hours ever since the wagon axle snapped 5 miles back. The driver, a man with shifty eyes and a weak chin, wanted to wait it out. But Abigail knew she couldn't stop. Waiting was a death sentence, because someone, might be on her trail. Then she saw it. Through the swirling curtain of snow, a faint, flickering glow, a light, a window, shelter. Hope, so sharp and desperate it was like a pain in her chest, forced her frozen legs to move faster. A small cabin slowly took shape in the storm, built of rough logs with a stone chimney puffing smoke into the angry sky. Someone was home. "Thank God," she whispered, but the monster wind stole the words from her lips. The last few feet to the porch felt like 100 miles. Her legs were shaking so hard she could barely stand. She raised a numb hand and knocked. The sound was pathetic, a tiny tap against the roar of the storm. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, pouring every last bit of her terror and desperation into it. "Hello, please. Is anyone there?" Silence, just the howl of the wind. With trembling fingers, she reached for the door handle. It felt like a block of ice, but she forced her fingers to close around it. She twisted. To her shock, it turned. The door swung inward on creaking hinges, spilling a wave of warmth that felt like a physical embrace. It was a dimly lit, simple room, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hello," she called again, hesitating on the threshold. "I'm so sorry to intrude, but the storm—" A sharp metallic click cut her off. It was the sound of a gun being cocked, and it came from the shadows right in front of her. "Don't move." The voice was low and rough, a man's voice, and it carried an edge that was as sharp and cold as the blizzard outside. Abigail froze. Her hand was still on the door, the other instinctively covering her unborn child. A figure stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway, but his face was gaunt, as if he'd just recovered from a long illness. His beard was unkempt, his clothes were worn, but they were clean. But it was his eyes that locked her in place. They were hazel, and they were filled with a soul-deep weariness. And something else. Pain. Loss. And in his hands, held steady and sure, was a rifle, and it was pointed directly at her heart. "Please," Abigail whispered, her voice cracking. "I mean no harm. The storm. I couldn't." She swayed, black spots dancing in her vision as the sudden warmth of the cabin went to war with her frozen body. The man's expression flickered. The hard edge in his eyes softened just a fraction, replaced by concern as he took in her condition. The swollen belly, impossible to miss. The blue tinge of her lips. The snow caked into the fine fabric of her coat. "You're with child," he said. It wasn't a question. He lowered the rifle just an inch, but it felt like the world had shifted on its axis. Abigail tried to nod, but the room was spinning violently now. The floor seemed to tilt and rush up to meet her. "I'm sorry," she managed to get out. "I didn't know where else to go." She was vaguely aware of him setting the rifle aside, of him moving toward her with a speed that was surprising for a man his size. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was his face, close now. A scar ran along his jawline, a pale white line against his weathered skin. His face wasn't a threat anymore. It was etched with worry. As she fell, as consciousness slipped away, she felt a sudden, terrifying warmth spread between her legs. Something wet. Blood. Her baby. No, not after everything. Not after all she had survived to protect this child. Not now. No, she whimpered, reaching out into the blackness. My baby. Strong arms caught her just before she hit the floor. Nathaniel Hayes hadn't been expecting company. Not in a blizzard that had buried the world, and not in his remote corner of Wyoming, where a man could go a whole winter without seeing a new face. When that door had swung open, his first instinct had been pure survival. Raiders, drifters, men made desperate by the cold often did desperate things. But instead of a threat, he found himself holding an unconscious, pregnant woman who was bleeding out on his floor. Pa, what's happening? The small voice came from the back of the cabin. Nathaniel looked up. His daughter, Rebecca, stood in the doorway of the bedroom. She was 9 years old, but her face was pale with a worry that made her look much older. Tucked behind her, clutching a small wooden horse, was his son, 5-year-old James. His eyes were wide and dark in the dim light. Get back to bed, both of you, Nathaniel said, his voice softer than he intended. We have a visitor. She needs help. She's bleeding, Rebecca stated, ignoring his command. The girl had grown too sharp, too observant in the months since her mother died. She saw things no child should have to see. Like Mama was. The words sent a chill down Nathaniel's spine that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. It's different, he said, the words firm, even though he had no idea if they were true. He kicked the door shut against the swirling snow. Rebecca, fetch some clean linens. James, get back to your room. Now. The boy retreated into the shadows, silent as a ghost. But Rebecca, his practical, brave Rebecca, moved immediately. She disappeared and returned moments later with an armful of clean sheets. Nathaniel carried the woman to the rough-hewn sofa near the fireplace. Up close, in the firelight, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Late 20s, maybe. Her features were delicate, her dark hair spilling out from a bonnet that had once been elegant. Her clothes, though soaked and torn, were made of fine wool. This was no drifter. This was a woman of means. Someone who had come a long, long way. Someone who was running. He knew that look. He'd lived it himself. The look of a person trying to outrun their own life. We need to get her dry and warm, Nathaniel said, mostly to himself. He and Rebecca worked together, a practiced team. They carefully removed the woman's wet outer layers, keeping her covered with blankets. The bleeding, he was relieved to find, was minimal, just spotting. Not the hemorrhage he'd feared, but her skin was like ice. Her breathing was shallow. As they worked to warm her, wrapping her in every blanket they owned, Nathaniel noticed something else. Dark bruises, like ugly purple thumbprints, circled her wrists. There were more on her upper arms, old and new, in various stages of healing. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He knew those marks. He'd seen them before. On the wives of powerful men. On women who were supposed to be protected, cherished. Marks left by hands that were meant to love, not to harm. Pa? Rebecca's voice was small. Is she going to die? Like Mama? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. No, Nathaniel said, the word a promise, a prayer. She's just cold, exhausted. She just needs to rest. As if on cue, the woman on the sofa stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. Nathaniel felt a surge of relief so strong it almost buckled his knees. Water, he told Rebecca, and the willow bark tea. Your mother's things. While Rebecca went to fetch them, Nathaniel stoked the fire, his mind racing. Who was this woman? What could have possibly driven a 7 months pregnant woman out into the worst blizzard in living memory? And more importantly, was the man who left those bruises on her arms coming after her? The woman moaned softly, her hand moving to her belly. You're safe, Nathaniel heard himself say, the words strange in the quiet cabin. Both of you are safe here. It was a promise he had no right to make to a complete stranger, but as the words left his lips, he knew with a terrifying certainty that he meant them. He would protect her. He had to, because as he looked at the bruises on her arms and the desperate hope in her unconscious face, he saw something familiar. He saw a reflection of his own past, of the monsters he too had tried to escape. And he knew this wasn't just a stranger at his door. This was a reckoning. Abigail drifted in a fog of fever and fractured memories. She was back in Boston, in the cold, opulent house that had been her prison. Maxwell's face, handsome as a devil, twisted in a sneer, his fingers digging into her arm. "Where do you think you're going, my love?" The sound of a whip cracking, not on a horse but against the wall, inches from her head. Fine china shattering, the doctor's pitying eyes after her first miscarriage. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwood. The baby didn't survive." Maxwell's rage. She had failed him. Again. The secret letters. The desperate plans. The final, terrible argument. The carriage careening off the rain-slicked road. Maxwell's body, broken at the bottom of the ravine. In her dreams, she had pushed him. In reality, it was his own drunken anger, his reckless speed. The funeral, the black veils hiding her relief. And then, the impossible discovery. Another child, a final gift or a final curse. His brother, Edgar, with his cold, calculating eyes. "We'll take care of you, Abigail." And the child, the Blackwood heir. Her escape, the trains and coaches, always heading west, away from the name, away from the money, away from the life that had almost destroyed her. And now, this, a cabin, the smell of wood smoke, and a voice. Her fever's breaking. A small, cool hand touched her forehead, a child's hand, gentle. Abigail forced her eyes open. The firelight was soft, dancing on the log walls. A young girl's face swam into focus. She had auburn braids and serious blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Pa, she's awake!" the girl called out. Heavy footsteps approached. It was the man with the rifle. In the better light, she could see the streaks of gray at his temples, the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. The scar on his jaw was a stark, pale line. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gruff, "how are you feeling?" Abigail tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her back, and she gasped. "Careful," he said, moving forward. "You've been out for nearly a day. You've been through an ordeal." "My baby," she whispered, the words scratching her raw throat. "The bleeding stopped," he said simply. "The child seems to be holding on." Relief washed over her, so powerful it felt like a physical wave. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she blinked them away. She would not show weakness in front of these strangers. "Thank you," she managed, "for taking me in. I'm Abigail. Abigail Foster." The lie came easily. Foster was her maiden name, a name she was desperately trying to reclaim. "Nathaniel Hayes," he replied. "This is my daughter Rebecca, and my son James." He glanced toward a corner where a small boy sat on the floor, clutching a wooden horse. The boy watched her with wide, silent eyes. He hadn't moved an inch. "The storm," Abigail started, but Nathaniel cut her off. "No need to explain. No one would turn a body away in weather like this." His tone was flat, but there was an undercurrent to it, something that suggested he knew this wasn't just about the storm. He knew she was running. "Still, I'm grateful. Once I'm able, I'll be on my way." A flicker of something, skepticism, pity, crossed his face. "The storm's still raging. The roads won't be clear for days, maybe weeks. Where were you headed in such a hurry?" She hesitated. The truth was she had no destination, only a direction, a way. "West," she said. "I have family in California." Another lie. She was getting good at them. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. She had the distinct feeling he could see right through her, that he knew every lie she told. But he just nodded. "You're welcome to stay until you're recovered and the weather clears. It's not much, but it's warm." "Are you hungry?" Rebecca asked, her voice surprisingly adult. "We have stew." The mention of food made Abigail's stomach rumble, loud and embarrassing. A blush crept up her neck. "Yes, please, if it's not too much trouble." As Rebecca served her a bowl of rich, savory stew, Abigail took in her surroundings. The cabin was small but sturdy. The furniture was simple, handmade but built with skill. But there was a sadness that clung to the place, a layer of dust on the mantel, a pile of mending left undone, an emptiness. "Your wife?" Abigail asked softly, already knowing the answer. "Passed. 4 months ago," Nathaniel said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Pneumonia." "I'm sorry." The words felt hollow, useless. He gave a short, sharp nod, then changed the subject. "That bleeding, has it happened before?" Abigail's hand flew to her belly. "Yes," she thought. "Once, after Maxwell pushed me down the stairs." But she couldn't say that. She just shook her head. "You should rest," he said, "as much as possible." As she ate, she noticed the little boy, James, was still watching her. His knuckles were white where he gripped the wooden horse. "That's a beautiful horse," she said gently. "Did your father make it for you?" The boy just stared, his grip tightening. "James doesn't talk much," Rebecca explained quietly. "Not since Mama died. And Pa didn't make the horse. Mama did." Abigail saw Nathaniel's jaw clench at the mention of his late wife. There was so much pain in this little room. "It's broken," Rebecca added, with the blunt honesty of a child. "The back leg. It fell off. Pa said he'd fix it, but he's been too busy." "Rebecca," Nathaniel warned. "It's true," the girl insisted. A strange impulse took hold of Abigail, a need to fix something, anything, in this house full of broken things. "Perhaps I could help," she offered, setting her empty bowl aside. "I'm handy with small repairs." Rebecca looked at her, skeptical. "You're a lady. Ladies don't fix things." A genuine smile touched Abigail's lips for the first time in months. "This lady does. My father was a clockmaker. He taught me how to work with small, delicate pieces." For the first time, the little boy, James, showed a flicker of interest. His eyes moved from Abigail's face to his beloved horse. "Could you really fix it?" Rebecca asked, a hopeful tremor in her voice. "I believe so," Abigail said, looking directly at the boy. "If your brother is willing to let me try." All eyes in the room turned to James. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. After a long, agonizing moment, the little boy stood up. He walked slowly, hesitantly, toward her. He stopped just out of reach, his small face a mask of solemn consideration. Then, with a reluctance that was almost painful to watch, he held out the broken wooden horse. The horse was a work of art, a small pinto, carved with such exquisite detail it seemed to be alive, its mane and tail flowing as if caught in a phantom wind. One of its back legs hung at a sickening angle, clearly broken at the joint. Abigail took it gently from the boy's trembling hands. "I see the problem," she said, her voice soft. "The joint is loose. It can be mended." She looked up at James, whose eyes had never left the horse. "But not tonight. Tonight I need to rest. And so do you. But tomorrow, if your father has some glue and small tools, I promise I'll make him as good as new." James stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a single, solemn nod before retreating back to his corner, his eyes never leaving the horse now resting in Abigail's lap. "He hasn't let that toy out of his sight since Elizabeth died," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion he was trying to hide. "It's the last thing she ever made for him." The weight of that statement settled in the small cabin. This wasn't just a broken toy. It was a broken heart, a last tangible piece of a mother's love. "I understand," Abigail said softly, her gaze meeting Nathaniel's over the sleeping children's heads. "Some things become anchors when the world feels like it's trying to sweep you away." Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past the frightened woman on his doorstep for the first time. He saw the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the resilience that had carried her this far. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They do." A fragile connection sparked between them, a silent understanding between two survivors, two people who knew what it was like to be broken, two people who were desperately trying to hold on to the pieces. The next morning, Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The storm had lessened its fury, settling into a steady, silent snowfall. She sat up carefully, relieved to find no fresh signs of bleeding. She dressed in her own clothes, which had been dried by the fire, and emerged from the bedroom to find the Hayes family at the kitchen table. It was a picture of domestic life, but a broken one. The empty chair where a wife and mother should be was like a gaping wound. The tasks were divided awkwardly between the grim-faced father and the too serious daughter, and the silent boy sat staring at his plate, the wooden horse placed carefully beside it. After a quiet breakfast, Rebecca eagerly brought the supplies for the repair. A small pot of wood glue, tiny clamps, a set of delicate tools that looked like they belonged to a watchmaker. Abigail set to work at the table, James hovering so close she could feel his breath on her arm. "Your mother was very talented," Abigail commented as she carefully applied a thin layer of glue to the broken joint. "This is extraordinary work." "Mama carved things all the time," Rebecca said from across the table. "She was making Pa a bear for Christmas, but she didn't finish it." Her voice trailed off. "He put all her carving tools away," she continued in a whisper. "Said he couldn't look at them anymore." Abigail's hands stilled. She understood that kind of grief, the kind that makes you want to erase every reminder of the person you lost, because the memories hurt too much. As she worked, fitting the leg back into place and securing it with the tiny clamps, she explained the process to James, not expecting a response. "See how the grain of the wood matches up? Your mother was very clever. She used the natural lines of the wood to make it look like the horse is really moving." The boy leaned in, his eyes wide with fascination. "The glue needs to dry completely," she told him. "It will take a few hours. But when it's done, this leg will be just as strong as the others, I promise." To her absolute shock, James reached out a small, hesitant hand and touched her arm. Not the horse. Her. The touch was light as a feather, but it sent a jolt through her. It was a gesture of pure, unspoken gratitude. "You're welcome," she said softly. From outside came the steady, rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting wood. Nathaniel. Through the window, she could see him at the woodpile, swinging the axe with a controlled violence. Each stroke was perfect, efficient, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a fury in his movements. "Pa's been cutting a lot of wood since Mama died," Rebecca observed, following her gaze. "He says it's for the winter, but I think he just needs to hit something." The girl's perception was chilling. Abigail looked from the man outside, channeling his grief into hard labor, to the silent boy beside her, channeling his into a broken toy. This family was drowning in unspoken sorrow. Just then, the door opened, and Nathaniel came in, his face flushed from the cold and the work. He stomped the snow from his boots, his eyes immediately falling on the clamped horse on the table. "Making progress?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The repair is simple," Abigail replied. "It just needs time to set." He nodded, then looked at his children. "Rebecca, the chickens need feeding. James, come help me bring in more firewood." The children obeyed, but James cast a worried look back at the horse. "It will be safe," Abigail assured him. "I'll watch over it." When they were gone, Abigail was alone for the first time since she'd arrived. She stretched carefully, her back aching. Her eyes fell on a small bookshelf in the corner. Among the practical guides to farming and a well-worn Bible was a leather-bound journal, Elizabeth's journal, the one Rebecca had mentioned. It felt like a profound invasion of privacy, but she was drawn to it. She crossed the room, her fingers hovering over the worn leather cover. What secrets did it hold? What was this woman whose ghost haunted every corner of the cabin really like? But before she could bring herself to open it, she heard a sound from outside that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of a horse moving fast, too fast for this kind of weather. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. A rider was approaching the cabin, a dark figure against the endless white. He was hunched low against the wind, urging his horse through the deep snow with a desperate intensity. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't a friendly visitor. This was someone in a hurry, someone searching. Her mind screamed one name, Edgar. But as the rider drew closer, she realized it wasn't her brother-in-law. This man was different, rougher. He wore a heavy buffalo coat and a low-slung gun belt. A bounty hunter? A lawman? He pulled his horse to a halt in the yard, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the barn where Nathaniel and the children were. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't looking for her. He was looking for Nathaniel. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Who was this man? And what trouble was he bringing to the one place she had finally started to feel safe? The knock on the door was loud, authoritative. It wasn't a request for shelter. It was a demand. Abigail's hand flew to the fireplace mantel, where Nathaniel's rifle rested. He kept it loaded. He'd told her that himself. She had never fired a gun in her life. Her father, the clockmaker, had despised them. Maxwell had kept a pearl-handled pistol in his desk, but she had never been allowed to touch it. But this was not Boston, and she was not the same woman. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy stock of the rifle. She lifted it down. It was heavier than she expected. She didn't know how to aim, how to fire, but she knew how to look threatening. She hoped. She moved to the side of the door, pressing her back against the rough log wall, the rifle held tight against her chest. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling only slightly. "Open up! I'm looking for Nathaniel Hayes. I know he's in there." The voice was rough, impatient. This was not a friend. She had to warn Nathaniel. But how? The man was between her and the barn. Just then, the door to the children's room creaked open. Rebecca stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She held a finger to her lips, then pointed toward the small window at the back of their room. A back window, an escape route. Abigail understood immediately. She gave Rebecca a sharp, desperate nod. The girl vanished back into the room, closing the door silently. Abigail prayed she would be fast. She prayed she would be quiet. Bang, bang, bang! The man was pounding on the door now, the wood groaning under the force of his fist. "Hayes, I know you're in there. Don't make me kick this door down. The sheriff sent me. I have a warrant." A warrant? For Nathaniel? For what? Abigail's mind reeled. The court-martial he'd mentioned. Had his past finally caught up to him? The front door splintered near the handle. He was trying to break the lock. She didn't have much time. She had to stall. "Just a minute," she yelled, trying to sound annoyed, not terrified. "I'm not decent." She heard him mutter a curse outside, but the pounding stopped. For a moment, she peered through a small crack in the window shutters. She could see the back of the cabin. A small figure, Rebecca, was scrambling out of the low bedroom window, landing softly in a snowdrift. The girl was tiny, but she was fast. She stayed low, using the woodpile for cover as she sprinted toward the barn, a small, desperate shadow against the snow. Abigail let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Rebecca was safe. She had warned her father. Now they would come, but would they be in time? The splintering sound at the door started again, louder this time. The lock was about to give way. Abigail hefted the rifle, her knuckles white. She didn't know who this man was or why he was here, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not getting into this cabin. He was not getting near her children, not while she was still breathing. The door burst open with a crash, flying inward off its hinges. The man stood there, silhouetted against the bright snow, a pistol in his hand. He was big, burly, with a mean-looking face and cold, dead eyes. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw her, the pregnant woman holding a rifle that was shaking in her hands. "Well now," he sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "What do we have here? Looks like Hayes found himself a new woman. Put the gun down, lady. I don't want to have to hurt you." "Get out," Abigail said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. She was surprised by how steady it sounded. "Get out of this house, now." He took a step inside, his smile widening. "I don't think so. I have business with your man. Once he gets here, you and I can get better acquainted." When he took another step. The room was small. He was only a few feet away. She could smell the whiskey on his breath. Suddenly, from behind him, another voice rang out, cold and clear as the winter air. "That's far enough, Miller." It was Nathaniel. He stood at the edge of the tree line, not near the barn where she expected him. He must have circled around. In his hands he held a hunting rifle, and it was not shaking at all. James and Rebecca were nowhere to be seen. He had hidden them. The man Miller spun around, his pistol swinging toward Nathaniel. "Hayes, I knew you were here. The sheriff wants a word." I'm sure he does, Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously calm. But you're not the sheriff. You're a hired thug. And you just broke down my door and threatened my wife. So I suggest you drop your weapon and leave. Now. Miller laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You're in no position to be making suggestions, Hayes. I have a warrant for your arrest. For desertion. Desertion? The word hung in the air. This was worse than a simple court-martial. This was a capital offense. That charge was cleared years ago, Nathaniel said, his eyes narrowed. Was it? Miller sneered. Funny. The paperwork seems to have gotten lost. All the sheriff has is a warrant signed by a federal judge, and he's paying me a handsome fee to bring you in. Dead or alive. Abigail's heart stopped. This wasn't about justice. This was an assassination, sanctioned by a piece of paper. Someone wanted Nathaniel dead, not just disgraced. Dead. Who sent you? Nathaniel demanded. Who reopened the file? Miller just smiled. An old friend of yours, I believe, from your army days. Someone whose business you interfered with. He has a long memory and deep pockets. He wants to tie up loose ends. Abigail's blood ran cold. An old friend. Business. The Blackwoods. It all clicked into place with a sickening certainty. This wasn't about Nathaniel's past. This was about hers. Edgar hadn't just hired lawyers. He had dug into Nathaniel's past. He had found this old buried charge. He had used his money and influence to have the warrant reissued. He wasn't trying to take her child through the courts. He was trying to get Nathaniel out of the way. Permanently. It's not you they want, Abigail said, her voice shaking as the horrific realization dawned. It's me. My family did this. Nathaniel's eyes flickered toward her for a fraction of a second, but his aim never wavered. He understood. He saw the whole, ugly picture. Miller seemed to enjoy the confusion. Doesn't matter who wants what, he said, shifting his weight, preparing to make a move. All that matters is who walks away from this. In that split second, everything slowed down. Miller's gun started to rise, Nathaniel's finger tightened on the trigger, and Abigail, the clockmaker's daughter, who had never held a gun, who had been taught that violence was never the answer, did the only thing she could think of. She swung the heavy rifle like a club. She wasn't aiming. She wasn't thinking. She was just reacting. A mother protecting her family. The heavy wooden stock of the rifle connected with Miller's gun hand with a sickening crack. The pistol flew from his grasp, skittering across the floor. He roared in pain and fury, clutching his shattered wrist. He spun toward her, his face a mask of rage, his good hand reaching for her. But he never made it. A single shot rang out from the tree line. It was deafening in the sudden silence. Miller jerked backward, a look of stunned surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He stumbled back, his eyes wide, and then collapsed onto the snow-covered porch, his blood staining the pristine white a shocking, brilliant red. Silence. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the pines. Nathaniel walked slowly out of the trees, his rifle still held at the ready. His face was grim, a mask of stone. He knelt beside Miller's body, checking for a pulse. There was none. He looked up at Abigail, who was still standing in the ruined doorway, the heavy rifle clutched in her hands, her whole body shaking. It's over, he said, his voice rough. But Abigail knew it wasn't. This was just the beginning. Edgar had shown his hand. He wasn't just going to fight for her child. He was willing to kill for it. The hours after the shooting were a blur. Nathaniel worked with a grim efficiency that spoke of his military past. He wrapped Miller's body in a canvas tarp and secured it in the barn. He methodically repaired the broken door, his hands sure and steady as he hammered new planks into place. He didn't speak much. The silence in the cabin was heavy, oppressive. Rebecca and James were quiet, their young faces etched with a fear they didn't fully understand. They knew something terrible had happened. They had heard the gunshot. They had seen the blood on the snow. Abigail held them close, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel herself. When the children were finally asleep, tucked into their beds with the wooden horse standing guard, Abigail and Nathaniel sat at the table in the dim lamplight. He said my family sent him, Abigail whispered, the words tasting like poison. Edgar did this. I know, Nathaniel said, his voice flat. Miller mentioned an old business associate. I testified against a group of suppliers back in Washington, men who were selling faulty equipment to the Army at inflated prices. One of them was Blackwood Shipping and Manufacturing. The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. You knew? You knew who my family was? Not at first, he said, his eyes filled with regret. But when you said the name Blackwood, I remembered. I didn't want to frighten you. I thought it was just a coincidence. A different branch of the family, maybe. He ran a hand over his tired face. I was a fool. I should have known they wouldn't let you go that easily. People like that, they don't have loose ends. They sat in silence, the terrible truth of their situation settling over them. Edgar wasn't just a grieving brother-in-law. He was a ruthless businessman whose family's corruption Nathaniel had once threatened to expose. This wasn't just about an heir. This was about revenge, and it was about silencing the two people who knew their secrets. We have to leave, Abigail said, her voice desperate. We can pack what we can and go. Tonight. Head further west. To California, like I said. We can change our names. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. And what then, Abigail? Run forever? Look over our shoulder every day for the rest of our lives? What kind of life is that for these children? For our child? He reached across the table and took her hand. His was calloused and warm. No. The running stops here. This is our home. We're not leaving. But Nathaniel, they'll send someone else. A sheriff. A marshal. They have a warrant. A warrant based on a lie, he said, his voice hardening. And we have a body in the barn. A hired killer sent to murder a United States citizen on his own property. Miller made a mistake. He said the sheriff sent him. That gives us an advantage. What are you going to do? Tomorrow at dawn, he said, his eyes glinting with a steely resolve she had never seen before. I'm going to ride to Pine Creek. I'm going to bring the body with me. And I'm going to tell the sheriff exactly what happened. He squeezed her hand. I'm not going to let them hunt us. I'm going to hunt them. The next morning, Nathaniel rode out, the tarp-wrapped body of Miller tied to a spare horse behind him. Abigail was left alone with the children, the repaired door, and a terrible gnawing fear. What if the sheriff in Pine Creek was already in Edgar's pocket? What if they arrested Nathaniel and left her and the children defenseless? The day dragged on, each hour an eternity. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Late in the afternoon, she saw them, two riders approaching from the direction of Pine Creek. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it Nathaniel, or was it the law coming to arrest her, to take her children? As they drew closer, she recognized Nathaniel's horse. The other rider was a tall man with a silver star pinned to his chest. The sheriff. They rode into the yard and dismounted. The sheriff was an older man, his face weathered and stern. He looked from Abigail's pregnant form to the two small children peering from behind her skirts. Ma'am, he said, his voice a low rumble. I'm Sheriff Brody. Your husband has told me a very interesting story. It's the truth, Abigail said, her voice clear and strong. The sheriff's eyes were sharp, assessing. He also told me who you are, who you were, Mrs. Abigail Blackwood of Boston. He looked down at the ground for a long moment, then met her eyes again. A few days ago, a fancy gentleman from Boston came to my office. Mr. Edgar Blackwood. He showed me a warrant for your husband's arrest on a desertion charge. He told me a story about his poor, confused sister-in-law who had run off with the family fortune and fallen in with a dangerous fugitive. Abigail's blood ran cold. He lied. I know, the sheriff said. And then he did something that shocked her. He smiled. A small, grim smile. You see, Mr. Blackwood made a mistake. He assumed that because this is a small, quiet town, we're all simple-minded fools. He offered me a very large sum of money to ensure Mr. Hayes didn't make it back to the jail alive. The sheriff spat on the ground. I don't take kindly to city folk who think they can buy justice in my county. I sent a telegraph to the federal marshal in Cheyenne this morning, asked him to look into that old desertion warrant. Just got a reply an hour ago. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. Turns out the warrant was dismissed and sealed by a military tribunal 15 years ago. The charges were found to be without merit. The paperwork Mr. Blackwood had was a forgery, a very good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Abigail felt her knees go weak with relief. Nathaniel put a steadying arm around her. When your husband rode in this morning with a dead bounty hunter and a story about protecting his family, the sheriff continued, it all started to make sense. So I paid a little visit to Mr. Blackwood at the boarding house. He was just packing his bags, getting ready to skip town. The sheriff's smile widened. He's not skipping town anymore. He's currently a guest in my jail. Forgery of a federal document, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempting to bribe a law officer. I think he's going to be my guest for a very, very long time. The world, which had been spinning out of control, suddenly righted itself. It was over. It was truly over. What about? Abigail started, not sure how to ask. The shooting? The sheriff looked at Nathaniel. From what I can tell, a man defended his home and his family from a hired killer. That's not a crime in my book. That's just being a good husband and father. He tipped his hat to Abigail. Looks like you found a good one, ma'am. As the sheriff mounted his horse to ride back to town, a new figure appeared. Reverend Wallace, his face etched with concern, rode into the yard. Nathaniel, the sheriff told me what happened. Are you all right? Is Abigail? We're fine, Reverend, Nathaniel said. Thanks to you. The Reverend looked confused. Me? I did nothing. When Edgar Blackwood came to you, Nathaniel said, you knew something was wrong. You sent him on a wild goose chase. You gave us time. The Reverend's eyes twinkled. The good Lord calls on us to offer sanctuary to those who need it. And sometimes, he added, with a glance at the sheriff, to have a little faith in the wisdom of our local law enforcement. A week later, Reverend Wallace stood in the main room of the small cabin. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth. The repaired door stood strong. Rebecca, in a new blue dress, stood beside Abigail, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had found in a sheltered patch of snowmelt. James, clutching his fixed wooden horse, stood beside Nathaniel, his face solemn but his eyes shining. The ceremony was short and simple. The words were not just a legal formality, but a heartfelt promise. A promise to build a life together, to protect each other, to be a family. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel leaned down and kissed Abigail. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of quiet, profound gratitude. A kiss that sealed a bond forged in a blizzard, tested by violence, and solidified by love. A few weeks later, as the first true signs of spring began to soften the harsh landscape, Abigail gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel, a strong, simple name for a boy who had been born into a world of both great danger and great love. One evening, as Abigail rocked the baby by the fire, Nathaniel sat beside her, watching his family. Rebecca was reading a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. James was on the floor, making his wooden horse gallop across the braided rug. The cabin was filled with a sense of peace that was so deep, so complete, it felt like a miracle. He looks like you, Nathaniel said softly, his eyes on the baby in her arms. He has your eyes, Abigail replied, smiling. They had faced the monster and won. They had stood their ground, and in doing so, they had built something beautiful and strong in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. A shelter, a sanctuary, a home. The story of the pregnant woman in the blizzard and the haunted rancher who took her in became something of a legend in Pine Creek. They said it was a story about how sometimes the most broken things can be mended, and how the most unexpected storms can lead you to the safest harbor. If you enjoyed this story of survival and finding family in the most unlikely of places, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what other strange and powerful stories are waiting to be told, just waiting for a knock on the door in the middle of a storm.